The drive home felt like it would never end. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the distance, as if it went on forever. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of tall, green trees that lined both sides of the road. The dappled light danced across the car's windows, making ever-changing patterns. Now and then, the sunlight would hit just right, flashing straight into your eyes in the most annoying way. The forest surrounding the road was thick with towering trees, their deep green leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Aside from the hum of the car's engine, everything was quiet. That kind of quiet that almost wraps you up, making things feel calm and peaceful. But despite the beauty of the drive, you couldn't call the ride pleasant. Not with the tension hanging thick between the two people in the car. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her early 40s. Her short brown hair was neatly styled, framing her face in a way that suited her well. She had on a simple outfit, a green V-neck t-shirt that matched her deep green eyes and a pair of blue jeans. Tiny diamond studs sparkled faintly in her ears, peeking out from behind her hair whenever the light hit them just right. Honestly, she looked like the kind of mom you'd see on TV, the normal kind that blended in with everyone else. But there was one thing about her that set her apart. The tired, dark circles under her eyes. They told a story of sleepless nights or too many worries. Her face, usually the kind you'd imagine breaking into a warm smile, was clouded with sadness. It was as though the weight of something heavy had settled on her shoulders, dimming the light she probably carried most days. Every now and then, she would sniffle, wiping her nose quickly before glancing in the rearview mirror at her son in the back seat. He was hunched over, his arms wrapped tightly around his chest, his head resting against the cold window. He looked nothing like a normal kid, and anyone who glanced at him could immediately tell something wasn't right. His messy brown hair stuck out in all directions, and the soft light from the car's interior highlighted his pale skin, which almost had a grayish tint to it. His eyes were dark, not like his mother's bright green ones. He wore a plain white t-shirt and hospital-issued scrub pants. The clothes he'd been given after his own had been torn up and stained with blood. His face bore a few cuts, and there was a split in his eyebrow. His right arm was wrapped in bandages that went all the way up to his shoulder, the result of it crashing into the shattered glass during whatever had happened to him. It was easy to see that his injuries must have hurt, but the truth was he couldn't feel a thing. That was just one of the things that came with being him. Growing up with a rare condition meant that he was completely numb to pain. He could have lost an arm and he wouldn't have known it. But there were other challenges too, like his Tourette's syndrome. That one had earned him all kinds of cruel nicknames back in the days when he still went to regular school. It made him twitch and jerk uncontrollably, sometimes cracking his neck or making other odd movements. The other kids would make fun of him, calling him things like Titchy Bobby, and mocking his every move. They'd twitch and laugh, trying to make him feel smaller. It got so bad that he had to switch to homeschooling. It was just too much, too cruel for him to handle. Every day felt like a battle, with kids poking at him and making fun of him as if it was all some kind of game. Bobby stared out the window, his face expressionless, his eyes blank as he lost himself in thought. Every so often, his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. The slightest bump in the road would make his stomach churn, sending waves of discomfort through him. His name was Bobby Rogers, and the last time he'd been in a car, it had crashed. That's all he could think about. It wasn't even something he tried to remember. It just kept playing in his mind, over and over, the images of the crash and everything that happened before he blacked out. Bobby had been the lucky one. His sister hadn't been so fortunate. Every time he thought about her, a lump formed in his throat, and tears threatened to well up in his eyes. The memories came rushing back, the horrible sound of her scream, the kind of scream that was suddenly cut off when the front of the car smashed in. Everything had gone quiet after that, like the world had paused. And when Bobby had opened his eyes again, the scene that greeted him was something he could never forget. His sister's body, lifeless, with shards of glass embedded in her forehead. Her hips and legs crushed by the steering wheel's force, and her torso bent in an unnatural way from the airbag that had deployed too late. That image of her, broken and still, was the last thing he ever saw of his older sister. The drive home stretched on, feeling like it would never end. They were taking their time, mostly because his mom was doing everything she could to avoid passing by the crash site. But as the scenery shifted and they finally entered the familiar neighborhood, both of them couldn't wait to get out of the car and into the safety of their own home. The neighborhood was old, with charming little houses lined up close together, their lawns neatly trimmed. As the car rolled past a blue house with white window panes, something caught both their attention. There, parked in front of the house, was an old vehicle, and standing in the driveway was a figure they both recognized. Bobby's stomach twisted with instant anger and frustration at the sight of his father, the man who hadn't been there when everything fell apart. As his mother pulled the car into the driveway and turned off the engine, Bobby could feel the tension building. She was getting ready to face him. "Why is he here?" Bobby muttered, his voice low as he glanced at his mom, who was already reaching for the door handle. "He's your father, Bobby?" she replied in a flat, emotionless tone, trying to sound more steady than she actually felt. "He's here because he wants to see you." Yet he couldn't find the time to drive to the hospital and see Lyra before she died, Bobby said, narrowing his eyes as he stared out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah. When is he not?" Bobby snapped, pushing the door open before his mom could even get out. He stumbled out onto the driveway and met his father's gaze, but quickly looked down at his feet, his expression hardening. His mother stepped out right behind him and exchanged a look with her husband. Then she walked around the car, wrapping her arm around Bobby's shoulders and gently guiding him toward the door. His father opened his arms wide, expecting her to embrace him, but she just walked right past him, keeping her focus on Bobby. "Connie," his father said in a raspy voice. "What, no welcome home hug?" She didn't acknowledge him. She just continued to walk past him, her son still tucked under her arm. "Hey, he's 16, he can walk by himself," his father called out, starting to follow them inside. "He's 17, Connie shot back, glaring at him before opening the front door and stepping inside. "Toby, let's get you into your room to rest. Okay? I'll come get you when dinner's ready." "No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself," Bobby retorted sarcastically, glaring back at his father. With that, he stumbled up the small staircase, slammed his bedroom door behind him, and locked it. His room was small, just a simple bed, a dresser, and a window. A few picture frames were scattered across the walls, pictures of his family from back when they still felt like a family. Before his father had turned into an alcoholic and started hurting the people closest to him. Bobby remembered all too well the fights his parents had. The one that stood out the most was the night his father had grabbed his mom by the hair and thrown her to the floor. When Lyra had tried to step in, he shoved her too, and she hit her back on the corner of the kitchen counter. Bobby could never, ever forgive his father for what he did to his mom and his sister. Never. Bobby didn't care how much his father beat him down, he couldn't feel it anyway. What he cared about was how his father had intentionally hurt the only two people Bobby truly cared about. And when he had been waiting in the hospital for his sister to take her last breaths, the only person who hadn't rushed to be by her side was his dad. Standing by the window, Bobby gazed out at the street below. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, but he quickly blamed it on the medication he was on. When dinner time finally came and his mother called up to him, Bobby slowly made his way downstairs. He hesitated before sitting down at the table across from his father, with an empty chair between them. The silence in the room was thick as his parents picked at their food, but Bobby couldn't bring himself to eat. Instead, he stared blankly at his father. His mother noticed and gently nudged him with her elbow. Bobby shifted his gaze to her for a moment before looking back down at his untouched plate. Later, when it was time to go to bed, Bobby pulled the covers up over his head and stared out the window. He was exhausted, but there was no way he could sleep. There was too much running through his mind. He was torn between listening to his mother and forgiving his father or keeping up the burning grudge that filled him with hate. The door creaked open, and Bobby felt his mother quietly enter the room. She sat on the edge of the bed, gently rubbing his back as he faced away from her. "I know it's hard, Bobby. Trust me, I understand," she said softly. But I promise things will get better. When's he gonna leave? Bobby asked, his voice trembling with a kind of innocence. Connie looked down at the floor, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the answer. I don't know, honey. As far as I know, he's staying. Bobby didn't say anything more. He just kept his eyes fixed on the wall, holding his injured arm close to his chest. After a long moment of silence, his mother sighed. She leaned in and kissed his cheek before standing up and walking toward the door. Good night, she whispered as she closed the door behind her. The hours seemed to drag on, and Bobby couldn't stop tossing and turning in his bed. Every time his mind wandered, the sounds of the crash replayed in his head. The screeching tires, his sister's terrified screams, and every time he would jerk awake, his body responding without his control. He threw the covers off, lying on his back, and pulled his pillow over his face, his body shaking as he cried into it. His sobs filled the silence of the room. If it weren't for the pillow, he would have been screaming, but instead he just wept, each breath coming in short gasps. After a moment, he yanked the pillow off his face and sat up, hunched over, his hands clutching his head. His breath came in quick, ragged gasps, and tears streamed down his face. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He had tried to keep it together, but it was no use. The whining, the whimpering, it all spilled out as he shook, unable to stop. He took a few deep breaths, forcing himself to calm down. Slowly, he stood up and shuffled around the bed toward the window. He peered outside, hoping the cool night air might ease his mind. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the blur of tears, and looked out at the cluster of tall pine trees across the street, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the breeze. Bobby stopped in his tracks, his gaze locking onto something standing under the streetlight. A ringing started in his ears, drowning out everything else, and he couldn't look away. The figure stood motionless beside the light, its height about 2 feet shorter than the pole itself. Its long arms hung loosely at its sides as it stared up at Bobby, its face completely featureless. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Yet somehow, Bobby felt as if the figure was staring straight into him, into the very depths of his soul. The ringing in his ears grew louder with each passing second, intensifying, until everything around him suddenly went black. When Bobby woke up the next morning, he found himself lying in his bed. Something felt different. He wasn't tired at all, and when he became fully conscious, it was as if he had been awake for hours already. His mind felt empty, devoid of any thoughts. He sat up slowly and staggered to his feet, but as soon as he stood, dizziness washed over him. He stumbled toward the door, then made his way downstairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was glued to the small TV on the counter, while his mother was reading the newspaper. She quickly glanced over, sensing Bobby's presence behind her. Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You've been asleep forever. His mother greeted him with a hesitant smile. Bobby slowly turned his gaze to the clock and saw that it was already 12:30 p.m. I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you up, but I thought you needed the rest. Her smile faded, replaced by a worried look as Bobby didn't respond. Are you okay? Bobby stumbled over to the table and sat down beside his father. It felt like he was on autopilot, moving without any control over his actions. He could see everything he was doing, but it didn't quite register in his mind. He reached out to touch his father's arm, but before he knew it, his hand was slapped away. His father jerked around in his seat, kicking the chair back with his foot. Don't touch me, boy, he yelled. His mother quickly stood up, a flash of anger in her eyes. All right, knock it off. That's the last thing we need right now. Days passed, and life seemed to go on as it always had. Connie spent most of her time cleaning the house while her rude husband spent his days barking orders at her. It felt like nothing had changed, like things were back to how they used to be before the crash. Bobby hardly ever left his room. He would sit on the edge of his bed, trembling. His mind wandered, but his thoughts changed so quickly that he couldn't hold on to any of them. Sometimes, he would pace around his small room, like a caged animal, or just stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued, over and over. Connie, on the other hand, kept being pushed around by her husband, far too submissive to him, while Bobby remained locked away in his room. Before he could stop himself, Bobby would begin chewing on his hands, tearing the skin from his fingers. He gnawed on them until they bled. When his mother found him in the middle of it, her reaction was horrified. She rushed him downstairs, grabbed the first aid kit, and wrapped his hands in bandages. Once she finished, she told him firmly that he wouldn't leave her side again. Bobby grew so isolated that he started to despise being around other people. His memory began to fail him, too. He'd forget entire stretches of time, minutes, hours, even days. Conversations would slip away from him, and he'd start talking nonsense, rambling about things that had no connection to what was happening. He would go on about seeing things, like sharks swimming in the sink as he washed dishes or hearing crickets in his pillows. He even claimed he saw ghosts outside his bedroom window. His mother's anxiety about his mental health grew so much that she decided it would be best for him to talk to a professional about what he was going through. Connie walked Bobby into the building, gently holding his hand and guiding him through the entrance. She led him up to the front desk, where she began talking to the woman sitting behind it. "Mrs. Rogers?" the woman asked. "Yes, that's me," Connie replied with a nod. "We're here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Bobby Rogers." "Yes, right this way," the woman said, standing up and leading them down a long hallway. Bobby's gaze wandered as he noticed the framed artwork along the walls, while he tuned into the sound of the woman's high heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped in front of a door, opened it, and gestured inside. "If we can get him to sit here for a few minutes, I'll go get the doctor," she said with a smile. Bobby stumbled into the room and sat at the table, his gaze moving from his mother to the woman before the door slowly closed behind them. He glanced around the room, then lifted his tightly bandaged hands, beginning to chew at the edges of the bandages to unwrap them. But before he could get far, the door swung open, and a young woman in a black and spotted dress with light blonde hair entered, holding a clipboard and pen. "Bobby?" she asked, offering a gentle smile. Bobby looked up and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Bobby. My name is Dr. Oliver," she said, extending her hand for a handshake. But when she saw his bandaged hands, she hesitated and pulled her hand back. "Oh," she said with a nervous smile, clearing her throat before taking a seat in the chair across from him. "So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer them as honestly as possible." "Okay," Dr. Oliver said, setting her clipboard down on the table. Bobby nodded slowly, keeping his hands folded tightly in his lap. "How old are you, Bobby?" 17, he answered quietly. She jotted that down on the paper attached to her clipboard. "What is your full name?" "Bobby Aaron Rogers." "When's your birthday?" "April 28th. "Who is your immediate family?" Bobby hesitated for a moment, then answered, "My mom, my dad, and—" He stopped, his voice catching. "And my sister." Dr. Oliver's expression softened, and she gave him a sympathetic look. "I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry." Bobby gave a small nod, but said nothing. "Do you remember anything from the crash, Bobby?" Bobby looked away from Dr. Oliver, his mind going completely blank for a moment. He stared down at his lap, the faint ringing sound echoing around him. His eyes widened, and he froze, unable to move. "Bobby?" the counselor asked. "Bobby, are you listening?" The ringing grew louder, and a shiver ran down his spine. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the small window in the door. There, standing just beyond the glass, was a dark, featureless figure. It stared at him, and he stared back, eyes wide. The ringing grew louder, almost deafening, until the counselor's voice broke the trance. "Bobby!" she yelled, causing him to jump. He fell sideways out of his chair, backing up into the corner, his breath erratic. Dr. Oliver stood up, clutching her clipboard to her chest, her expression one of surprise and confusion. Bobby met her eyes again. His breath hitched, and he twitched involuntarily. That night, Bobby lay in bed, dazed, staring at the ceiling. Just as he began to doze off, he heard footsteps scattering down the hallway. He sat up, looking toward the doorway. The room was dark except for the cold blue glow of the moonlight streaming through his window. He slowly got up and moved toward the door, but before he could reach it, it slammed shut in his face. He gasped, falling back in shock, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He lay still for a moment before slowly getting back on his feet. His hands trembled as he grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand. The door creaked open, and he stepped cautiously into the dark hallway. The moonlight illuminated the hallway as he padded quietly down, listening to the faint rustling of footsteps and the soft giggling of a child running ahead of him. The hallway felt longer than he remembered, endless like the long road home from the hospital. A door creaked ahead, and he called out, his voice shaky, "Mom!" Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut. He spun around, startled. He heard a long, eerie croak right in his ear, sending a chill down his spine. Turning quickly, he was face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded and white, her skin pale, and the right side of her jaw hung loosely by tissue and muscle. Glass shards protruded from her forehead, and black blood leaked down her face. Her blonde hair was still tied in a ponytail, just as it always had been, and she wore her old gray t-shirt and athletic shorts, now dirty and stained with blood. Her legs were bent at unnatural angles. She stood inches away from him, emitting a long, guttural croak. Bobby yelped, his body jerking backward in fear. "Ah!" He scrambled to crawl away from her, but his eyes remained locked on hers, those blank, lifeless eyes. He dragged himself backward, desperate to escape, but he soon hit something behind him. He froze. Everything was eerily quiet, save for his heavy breathing and the quiet sobs escaping him. Slowly, he looked up, and his gaze locked onto the blank face of a tall, dark figure, just like the one he had seen before. Behind the figure were rows of children, their ages ranging from 3 to 10 years old. Their eyes were pitch black and dark, black blood leaked from their eye sockets. A scream tore from Bobby's throat, and he scrambled to his feet, but before he could take another step, dark, black tendrils shot out from the ground, wrapping tightly around his ankle. He was yanked down, crashing onto his stomach, the air knocked from his lungs. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound escaped. He gasped for breath, his body trembling, until everything around him went black. Bobby awoke with a start. His scream echoed in the quiet room as he shot up, gasping for air. His heart raced, and his chest felt tight as he clutched his bandaged hands against his body. It was just a dream, just a dream. He lay back down on the bed, rolling onto his side. It felt as if a weight had been lifted from his chest as he breathed deeply, slowly calming down. He stood up and shuffled over to the window, peering outside. There was nothing there. No figures, no ghosts, just the empty, quiet street. Then, he heard the familiar sound of his father rustling and coughing in the hallway. Bobby hesitated before walking over to the door and opening it. He peered into the hallway, his eyes scanning the darkness. He padded quietly down the hallway and into the living room. There, he found his dad standing by the window, smoking a cigarette. Bobby paused in the doorway, watching him from the shadows. Then, a searing sensation ignited deep in his chest. A boiling anger, unrelenting and fiery, took hold of him. It felt as though something inside him snapped, and the little imaginary voices in his head began to rise, whispering and pushing him. "Do it, do it, do it." The voices in his head chanted, relentless and urgent. Bobby turned away, clutching his arms, trying to hold on to whatever control he felt he had. For the first time in weeks since the hospital, he actually felt like himself again, if only for a moment. He could think clearly, but it didn't last. The chanting started again, growing louder, clouding his thoughts. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. The voices urged. Bobby trembled, his heart pounding in his chest. No, he wasn't going to do it. Was he going crazy? No, he couldn't kill anyone. He hated his father, but there was no way he was going to take that step. That was the last coherent thought he had before the voices took over once again, drowning out everything else. He began to move, silent and controlled, his feet taking him closer to his father, guided by the force inside him. He reached over the counter to the knife case. His hand gripped the cold steel, the weight of it settling in his palm as his heart raced. The sensation in his chest tightened, suffocating him, but his body obeyed. A laugh escaped him, low at first, then building in intensity. He, ha 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 ha. His laughter bubbled up uncontrollably, forcing him to gasp for breath. His father turned around, his eyes widening in confusion and fear, before Bobby shoved him hard to the floor. The force knocked the air out of his father as he grunted. "What?" His father looked up at Bobby, who stood over him, the kitchen knife clutched tightly in his hand. "Toby, what are you doing?" His father scrambled to sit up, throwing his arms out in front of him in self-defense. But before he could react, Bobby was on top of him, pinning him down. His father grabbed for Bobby's wrist with both hands, trying to stop him, but Bobby didn't stop. With a desperate movement, his father threw an off-center punch toward Bobby's shoulder, but the blow didn't faze him. Bobby's grip tightened. The look in Bobby's eyes was wild, utterly unhinged. It was as if something dark, something demonic, had taken over him. He snarled, his rage building, and lunged forward, aiming the knife at his father's chest. His father, despite the shock, managed to block the blow, grabbing Bobby's wrist before the blade could sink in. Bobby's fury only escalated. He kicked out his legs, landing a powerful blow to his father's face. His father recoiled, instinctively raising his arms to cover his face, but it was no use. Bobby pushed himself up and, with a vicious snarl, drove the knife into his father's shoulder. His father screamed in agony, his hands scrambling to pull the knife out. But Bobby wasn't done. Before his father could react, Bobby threw a fist into his face, hard enough to make his father's head snap back. Bobby didn't stop there. He kept pounding his fists into his father's face, laughing in a wheezy, unsettling way. The sound of each hit echoed in the room, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond Bobby. Cracking his neck, Bobby pulled the knife out of his father's shoulder and plunged it deep into his chest. The blood splattered across the room in messy streaks, but Bobby didn't flinch. He kept stabbing, each strike a blur of madness. He didn't stop until his father's body went limp and still, the life draining from him. Breathing heavily, Bobby tossed the knife aside and leaned over his father's motionless form, panting and coughing. His eyes locked onto his father's battered face, and he sat there for a long time, twitching uncontrollably. Then, a loud scream shattered the silence. Bobby jerked his head up, eyes wide. His mother stood in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth, tears pouring down her face. "Bobby!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Why did you do that? Why?" Her words echoed in his mind, but Bobby didn't respond. His gaze shifted down to the blood-soaked bandages wrapped around his hands. Without a word, he backed away from his father's body, his feet dragging across the blood-streaked floor. His eyes locked onto his mother for just a moment before he turned and ran out of the room. He stumbled into the garage, panic rising in his chest. His hand slammed against the control panel on the wall, and the garage door slowly began to rise. Before he ran out, his eyes fell on his father's hatchets hanging on the tool rack above a table cluttered with jars full of old, rusted nails and screws. One of the hatchets was new, its bright orange handle gleaming under the dim light of the garage, while the other was old, with a worn wooden handle and a dull, rusted blade. Bobby gripped both tightly, his heart racing, as he noticed a box of matches on the table. Beneath it, a red gasoline tank sat ominously. He grabbed the matches and the gasoline, then ran out of the garage, sprinting down the driveway and up the street. As he neared the streetlight, he could see from his bedroom window. The sound of distant police sirens reached his ears. Bobby paused for a moment, then turned, his breath shallow as he saw the red and blue flashing lights speeding down the street toward him. Without hesitation, he twisted the cap off the gasoline tank and began spilling the liquid across the street in a wide arc. He ran, the gasoline trailing behind him, and then cut into the trees. Once he had emptied the tank, he pulled a match from his pocket. Striking it against the box, he quickly dropped it, and within moments, flames erupted around him. The fire spread quickly, devouring the trees and bushes. The silhouettes of police cars appeared through the growing blaze, but Bobby couldn't move. The fire surrounded him, a wall of heat and light. Panic surged in his chest as he backed deeper into the forest, but his vision grew blurry. His heart raced. This was it, the end. He closed his eyes, bracing for whatever would come next. But just as the heat became unbearable, Bobby felt a cold hand rest on his shoulder. His eyes snapped open, and his breath caught in his throat. A large, pale hand with long, bony fingers hung on his shoulder, its grip unyielding. He looked up, his body frozen in place. The arm connected to the hand was long and dark, leading up to a towering figure dressed in a black suit. Its face was completely blank. No eyes, no features. Just smooth, featureless skin. It loomed over Bobby, its presence suffocating. From its back, long tendrils stretched out, writhing in the smoke-filled air. Bobby's vision swam, the ringing in his ears growing deafening. Before he could react, everything went black. That was it. That was the end. That was how Bobby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. Lori, her sister, sat next to her, sipping from a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie had lost her husband and her son, and just a few weeks before that, she had lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she had moved in with Lori. The police had kept her busy, and they had just finished processing the case. The story had been released 2 weeks ago, and the focus of the world had already shifted to new headlines. Lori clicked the TV remote, switching on the news broadcast. The screen flickered for a moment before the news reporter began speaking. "We have breaking news. Last night, 4 individuals were reported murdered. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids were bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Investigators have discovered a weapon at the crime scene. It appears to be an old, dull-blade hatchet, which you can see here," the reporter continued, as the screen shifted to show a close-up of the weapon, exactly as it was left at the scene. Investigators have pulled the name of a possible suspect, Bobby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who stabbed his father to death a few weeks ago and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets and the surrounding forest. Although they believed the young boy had perished in the fire, investigators suspect Rogers might still be alive, as his body was never recovered.